Welcome to Sustainability and Life Cycle of Belief, Chapter 12 of Economics, Time, Mind, and Spirit. So what is sustainability? Sustainability describes a feedback mechanism between behavior and resources that is stable and enduring. Resources available underlies which behaviors are feasible, and behaviors influence what resources will be available. So example of sustainable resources, natural environments, social environments, economic environments, and religious/spiritual environments, among others. So this sustainability requires maintaining a regard for the future. And this takes retaining enough slack in our daily lives so as to remain connected with the future, even as a sense of communality with those yet to be born. So the idea here is if we're connected with the future in some way, even if it's a sense of those who are yet to be born, there'll be more of an inspiration towards wanting to sustain the world that we live in. Now, as a redux in terms of time preference, looking into past, present, and future, this should remind you of the different discount rates and the different focuses. So along with these are an institutional taxonomy by discount rate, or in other words, how quickly does the preference for the past or the future decay. The bottom, the momentary self that has a infinite discounting. On the top is the governing body, which will either be a government or possibly a religious institution, assuming that it has a discount rate close to zero. To the right, we see for-profit organizations going from steady state for-profit to growing for-profits to venture capital funds, each having an increasing discount rate by which they make their choices. To the left, we can understand this as education and research, entities that have a very low negative time preference. In other words, it's trying to maintain as much of the past as it can be understood as tradition education. A little less focus on maintaining the past might be liberal education, right? Because since part of the idea of liberal education is giving the students ability to have autonomy and to change and update views about the world as it changes. More steeply discounting the past will be research, since the whole point of research is to bring in new knowledge. So very close to the present. Okay, so positive time preference, for-profit in most households, a form of impatience for a desired future to occur sooner. Been described as the basis for positive interest rates and how most individuals' decisions are made. And in general, the greater the positive time preference, the less regard for the future. Negative time preference. So this is associated with traditions and received view education. To a certain extent, it is about a resistance to change. And the greater the NTP, the less regard for the past. Infinite time preference, it's basically being absorbed or immersed in the moment, essentially saying the consequences are irrelevant. So no regard for the future or the past, basically living in the moment. And zero time preference, as if all time is in the moment, governing or divine guidance, some people might describe it as that. Almost no regard for the present. In other words, there is some regard, but if you're looking at the total amount of weight, it's almost outside of the present. And the total regard would be bounded by time horizons. So even if you have a zero time preference, but you stop looking past 5 years into the future, the total amount of regard would be limited by the fact that your time horizon is cut off at 5 years. So sustainability is resources, attitudes, and communities. For an environment or community to be sustainable, it must include enough slack into its plans so that when exigencies occur, people are not tempted or forced to significantly change plans. This is known as robustness. There needs to be sufficient regard for the future and for the community to ensure that enough resources are passed on to the next generation for them to choose the expression of culture that is to be sustained. And here's some visuals to express this idea. So sustainability as a capacity to stay within a path. So in this first case, we see the squiggly curve going up and down a bit, but the boundaries of the path are outside of these curves. So the length of being sustained on this path is the whole way through. That's the red line with the arrows and two ends. It shows you the duration of time on the sustainability path. On the other hand, the narrower the path, in other words, less robust it is, the shorter that we stay on the path before we go outside of it. And for those who are familiar, these are sometimes referred to as control limits in quality control. And the narrower the path, the shorter the duration one is on it. So when we are talking about sustainability and robustness, clearly we're not talking about one way that it has to be very, very strictly adhered to count as if you're sustaining a path. Basically, if you make it too narrow, you're immediately outside of the sustainability experience, and then it would start falling apart. The conception of what is sustainable and how robust its experience is going to be important to maintain that sense of the sentiment associated with having been on the path a long time. And that sense of being on the path a long time does provide some motivation to sustain the path going forward. So staying within limits may require modifying our habituated tendencies. And so we can see that as taking resources and using willpower to decrease the highs and lows of an economy so that it can sustain itself longer. Which now brings up the question of economic growth. So the essence of economic growth is the expansion in the capacity to do an experience. We often show this as an expansion of the production possibility frontier outwards. Now, in contrast to economic growth is economic healing. So the essence of economic healing is to return to a set of resources and capacity that we remember having. So for example, if we break a bone, we must wait for it to heal before attempting to do more with it. Bring up healing because part of sustainability is going to be dealing with exigencies and issues of systems either breaking down or damage from unexpected events. And so that robustness would have to also be associated with being able to sustain the economic healing process to go with the economic growth. So growth and healing require different mindsets, spirits, and preferences. And because of that, we can talk about the growing healing cycle. And if you see in this image, it's composed of take the risk, feel the pain, stop the trauma, heal the wound, confront the fear, transform the spirit, and then returning to taking the risk. So let's look at these a little bit more in detail. Take the risk. So taking risks required for growth to occur. All right. So if you're going to have economic growth, if you're going to have growth in your own personal life, you have to take some risks. Now, it's the taking of risks that expands out production possibilities, right? Because until you take the risk, you don't know that you could do more. Okay, or what is the limit before you either have injury or the system starts breaking down. So taking risks is part of the process of growth. Now, the amount of risk to take is based on cost of failure and injury. So, for example, where you are in your life. If you're on the young side, let's say you're 18, you can take a lot of risks, because even if you have a failure or an injury, the cost in terms of lost time or pain or financial things will tend to be smaller, and is a much longer period of time to recover. Whereas if you're much older, taking risks requires a little bit of prudence, because the older we get, the more costly failures are, the more damaging injuries can be, and the less time to recover. Taking the risk. Eventually, you'll take risks and maybe it'll pan out for a while, but eventually, if you've been taking a risk, something will happen. There will be some kind of an injury. In order to move along this process, you have to feel the pain. If you injure yourself and you never feel the pain, then there is no awareness or consciousness of the injury having occurred. Okay, and the recognition that something has to change. One way we can understand this is, people that are risk takers, especially in business and finance and such, if they've set it up in such a way that other people will be suffering the pain of the failures of their investments, then those who are making the investments or making the bets never modify their behavior because they never feel the pain. Right? So there's a distinction between avoiding pain, relieving pain, and ignoring pain. So avoiding pain is something that moderates how much risk-taking you take. Relieving pain, you do recognize that you have pain, you have felt the pain, but it may be useful to relieve some of the pain. That doesn't mean you're completely oblivious to it, but you may want to relieve some of the pain so that you can move on with the healing process. And ignoring the pain is often a very dangerous approach, because again, if you ignore the pain, then you don't know if you're repeatedly injuring yourself. And that can also mean either injuring the economy, injuring the natural systems that we live in. So the amount of pain to feel depends on how it disrupts the system. If you feel pain so much that it keeps you from sleeping, that's going to disrupt the healing process. So in that case, you want to take pain relievers to quiet the pain enough so that you can sleep. But you don't want to take so much pain relievers that you never feel the pain, because it's part of what lets you know that you still need to be healed. So next is stopping the trauma. So you don't want to feel pain just to feel pain. The point of feeling pain is that it's a signal to you that you need to change. And what you need to change is whatever behavior that's occurring that's causing the trauma, either to you individually or to the socioeconomic system. So this is required for healing process to begin. If you never stop what's causing injury, you never get to healing. So continuation of trauma deepens injury and delays recovery. And again, this can be a wide range from physical to emotional, mental, spiritual, social, as well as financial and other aspects of trauma and injury. Okay, now once you've stopped the trauma, you're in a position to start healing the wound. So this is required before returning to behaviors and practices that could lead to harm again. In other words, great, you've stopped the behaviors that are hurting you. Now you've got to heal those wounds. Now, if you don't go through the process of healing the wounds, they stay open and they limit your capacity to do more, and can lead to even worse conditions. So healing is in contrast to growth. as healing is an attempt to return to what one was capable of. So growth is about expanding one's capacity to do something. Healing is about returning to what one was capable of. So when we talk about healing, this can be in the economic realm as well, we're talking about a recovering to what you used to be able to do or experience. So examples of economic healing would be repairing infrastructure and potentially clearing out fraud and deceits that might have caused all sorts of problems in the financial and legal regulation of the economy. Now, once you have healed the wound, it is time to confront the fear. Why? Because part of the healing process has been choosing to avoid behaviors that exacerbate the injuries. So this is embodied in some sense of fear of re-injury. Right? So even if you're not, being overwhelmed by fear, at some point in the healing process, one has to take on a sense of constraining their behavior so as not to re-injure themselves. Well, that's a practical or useful fear, right? Of avoiding re-injury. So that has now been incorporated into your decision-making and choice process. Once you have healed, right, in order to return to possibly getting back to growing in life again, now you have to confront the fear that has been embedded in your decision-making. All right, so once healing has occurred, that fear is no longer useful and needs to be confronted to move on. And that brings us to transform the spirit. Right? So this is the transformation from a spirit of healing to a spirit of growth. Right? It's required to continue progress in expanding capacities and autonomy. And the amount required is dependent on how challenging the healing process. Right? So, if you got a little cut and, you put some antibacterial ointment on it and then a Band-Aid and you're young, it might heal within, 2-3 days and look like it's never been a problem. On the other hand, if you're talking about, for example, the damage done to an economy during wartime, well, that's going to be a lot of time and effort required to rebuild manufacturers, rebuild roads, right? Rebuild the sense of community and some kind of hopefulness about the future that you can get back to what we might call a more normal, regular type of economy and economic growth. This is the part of the process that we're talking about, the change in priorities and preferences and perspectives that go from focusing on what you needed to do to heal to what you need to do to grow. And this is as important at the socioeconomic level as the individual level, because if we stay stuck in the spirit of healing, and we have already healed, now we are missing opportunities to grow. This transformation needs to occur. Now, this is not to imply that you're either only just healing or you're only just growing. There may be parts of your lives that needs healing and parts that are fine and you can continue to allow to grow. So you can have those two going on together, but it is also now a balancing act, right? Because if you focus too much on growth, maybe the part that needs to heal never gets healed. And similarly, if you're very focused on healing, then the part of you that could grow, or the part of the economy that could grow, doesn't grow as much as it could have. So balancing act. So what do we change? Well, if you want to change the feasible, that's the realm of technology, or acquiring and taking over resources that are available. Generally, in the economic worldview, what we're interested in is advancing technology, with the idea being that we can produce more with the same amount of resources. If we need to change what is acceptable, then we're looking at changing the moral, legals, laws, and ethics. If what we need to change is what's desirable, the spirit, what animates us, now we're dealing with changes in preferences and external motivations. And if it's about changing what inspires us, now we're talking about changing identity and internal motivations. So it is useful to be aware of where does the change most need to occur in order to leverage resources most effectively. How does one inspire sustainability? One, there continues to be a need for space for both doing and experiencing, getting things done, but also experiencing what it is that has been accomplished. You do good works, and then you get to experience the beauty or the satisfaction from it, and then it reinforces the priority and preferences for continuing on that path. As kind of we indicated before, there has to be resources for both healing and growing. So part of robustness is recognizing that there will be exigencies and things will go off and there will be injuries and occasionally damage. So you want to make sure that there's enough slack in the system that when healing needs to occur, it's available and it doesn't throw you off the long run sustainable path. Associated with that is tangible support for individuals to express a meaningful purpose beyond satisfying the material needs of the moment. By expressing a meaningful purpose, which will often be connected with not only a desire for the future, but a continuity of the past, it allows individuals to experience the joy or the satisfaction of being part of something larger than themselves, which is very important in willingness to do things and constrain their behaviors or bound their behaviors for the benefit of others, including others in the future. And associated with this will be encouraging corporations and policymakers to use lower discount rates in their decision making. Which now brings us to the issue of attitude and affluence. Attitude is a spirit of possibility. Affluence is the material capacity for expression. So we can imagine a little table here where under affluence you have the range from most affluent to least affluent, and with attitude a range from the most hopeful to the least hopeful. Now, those who are the most affluent and the most hopeful are the ones that are in a position to provide visionary sharing, right? They're in a position to imagine a future or other ways of being or wonderful goals to achieve, and to be able to share the resources, to distribute the resources necessary for its manifestation. Now, sharing doesn't necessarily mean just out and out gifting. It may show up as hiring people, but the main point is it's a recognition that whatever resources they have, it's not just about holding on to it for themselves. They need to provide resources to others so that they can have a life and be able to do something constructive that's going to further this vision that the most affluent and hopeful have. Okay, now there will be those that are least affluent. They have very little in the resources. But if they have a very hopeful attitude, what they can bring is their time and efforts. And so these are the individuals that can provide diligent work. Maybe they don't have much in the way of financial assets, they don't own land or natural resources, but they're willing to work hard, work conscientiously. That's a very valuable asset in trying to create a world that you want, and then to be able to sustain it. If you're dealing with people that are least hopeful, what you might find is that those are most affluent but least hopeful move towards myopic selfishness, right? Because if they're not very hopeful, they're least likely to share. They're least likely to invest in others. And the less that they share and include others, well, the more narrow their scope of, who they're concerned about, until, you get maybe the most narrow, selfish individual. So myopic selfishness. And then, unfortunately, those that have almost no affluence, right? They've got no resources and they have no hope. They're the ones that end up with paralyzing depression, right? Because they've got nothing to work with. They can't buy their way out of their problems. They would have to work, but they're feeling so hopeless. They're depressed and they're paralyzed by their depression. We can imagine these as continuums as compared to, one or the other. But one of the challenges is, anything that's going to move forward tend to want people that are more hopeful as compared to less hopeful. Even if their affluence, they may not be bringing a lot material to the table, but if they are, bringing their goodwill and efforts, that's still very valuable and important. Now, attitude and affluence, the two are related. As affluence increases, it's easier to sustain a hopeful spirit. The hopefulness of the wealthy and the poor are different, yet entangled, because the willingness of the poor to work underlies the hopefulness of the wealthy, and the willingness of the wealthy to share underlies the hopefulness of the poor. It's a desirable thing to have a lot of assets and to be able to be wealthy. But part of that wealth being useful is that there are people out there for whom you can buy what it is that you want. And so that means there has to be people out there doing some kind of work to help create the wealthy to be able to buy the things that they want and want to experience. So those that are more wealthy and have more in the way of financial assets, whether they're hopeful about the future may in part be dependent on, how they're looking at the workforce. Do they see the workforce as being hopeful of, like, okay, there's going to be a better life from working? Or is it the workforce starting to feel like, you know what, I'm going to work hard, it's going to be miserable, why should I care? Likewise, if you're poor, part of the hopefulness comes from seeing those who are wealthy either, gifting or granting, or at a minimum hiring, that there is paid work to be had, that even though you don't have much, you can still at least earn a living and, maybe maintain your family. Maybe it's a very modest life. It's still a life that can be fulfilling and meaningful and worthwhile. That's the minimal essential, the experience that your life is worthwhile. Now, this brings up the issue of the economic life cycle of belief. Now, what do we mean by that? We tend to optimize beliefs about the mundane and the divine that differ by age and life expectancy. So beliefs are based on what has been observed, what have you experienced in your own life, and what you desire to experience. And so there is a role of transcendence and faith. So even if what you observed has not been great, but if you desire to experience a more joyous life, a happier community, a healthier community, that desire may be helped by a sense of faith about the future and being able to be conscious and connected with something beyond, the suffering of the moment. These affect time horizon and preference. In youth, What drives belief when we're young is the sense of potential, imagination, and trust. So potential as in you have your whole life ahead of you. Imagination as, well, you haven't lived life yet, so you imagine what is possible. So the greater your imagination, the greater the sense of the potential for what the future is. And that can be very motivating. And when we're young, it is very much supported by our ability to trust the world, especially our families of origin, but also our local communities, to either help guide us in the right direction or provide us with the resources that we need to grow healthy and get whatever education we need, or to be able to start a productive life in some way. So belief systems when we're young, or the particulars of what young people will believe, is going to be dependent on or more focused on the animating of potential, imagination, and trust. Now, once we're in adulthood, especially when we're in, the prime of our lives, as the term is used, that is the time when you want to be getting things done, right? Because that's when you're in peak power, peak autonomy. So manifestation and reality, it's like it's happening now. It's occurring now. And empowerment. So the belief systems that we have in adulthood will be likely slightly different than when we're young, because those belief structures will need to support the capacity for manifestation, reality, and empowerment when we're at our prime. And what about late life? Well, at this point, a lot of our the resources, our internal resources, our health, our physical endurance and strength, that's going to start waning. So in late life, what will be of value is what has already been accomplished. So whereas when you're very young and you haven't had an opportunity to accomplish yet, it's about the potential to accomplish. When we're in adulthood, it's about doing things, the manifestation at the moment. And then when we're in later life, it's about, well, what have we accomplished? What's already happened? And so this is going to be associated with memories and with sentiment. You can understand as people get later into life, the beliefs that they will have will tend to support their sense of what they've accomplished, or getting the most out of the memories and sense of sentiment. By looking at this, what we see then is what we believe in the different cycles of our life will either support or make more difficult those aspects that are showing up most dominantly in the different phases of life. And so this brings up demographics and sustainability of beliefs. If we take the combination of sustainability and the Turnpike theorem, suggests that long-run equilibrium may require a stable population distribution over age and life expectancy. In other words, we've got the system going. It's a constructive feedback. And it's in a position to be able to sustain itself. There's enough inherent robustness to deal with most difficulties or exigencies that come up. But part of sustaining this then is maintaining the mix of beliefs that are required for the people who are doing work or managing or inventing to keep things going. And since each individual moves on, then it's going to be important that new young people come in that fulfill that role of the potential imagination and trust. But it shouldn't be overwhelming, because if the demographic balance gets off, then the socioeconomic system is going to move away from making the choices necessary for sustainability. So this maintains an ongoing balance of beliefs as well as looking back and forward. If sustainability is going to be important, then it's a notion of we want today to last into the future. Well, that means as we go into the future, we want to hold on to what's been in the past, right? Because that's what we're trying to sustain, or at least some of it. It's the constructing an as if higher regard from the various individual regards about the future and past. Okay, so that completes the set of podcasts for Economics, Time, Mind, and Spirit. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you would like, I'd be very happy to talk with you and communicate with you about your perspectives. Thank you again for listening and watching, and may you have many blessings.